And at some stage, someone decided we're going to do this with mail, and if the garment exists, it's worn over it. It's a separate thing. Now, we've got surviving Mamluk ones from the 1400s. We've got surviving Akoyanlu ones. So it's quite clearly, this is a very Western Asian thing. It went into, when the Mughals conquered India, it went into India. Now, since the Mughals themselves were Timurid, it seems pretty logical that they took it with them. Now, whether it was imported craftsmen that Timur brought back, because remember, he was a great person for globalization. He just, well, not so much trading as we'll just kidnap everybody from there and bring them over here. And
globalization at force, yes.
Yeah. And when you get back, you find, say, for instance, the largest number of surviving plate and mail armors comes from places in India, out of armories where they'd been stored since the 1600s.
Yes.
There's huge numbers of them. I actually got to put one on once because I used to be skinny, the good old days. And it was beautifully tailored. It had it was all riveted, had big rings in the arms, and then the rings got smaller in size as they went down until the skirts were very fine mail. It had like plates across the abdomen. It had 5 rows of little plates going down the back, yes, to make that tailored back. It was a beautiful thing. And it survived in an armory for 400 years.
Yeah.
Because one of the advantages of mail or mail and plate construction is that it's easy to maintain. You just cover it in grease and put it in a barrel. If it survives in India with the humidity and the heat and everything else, it will survive anywhere. It was Bekter in Russia. It was very popular. And you've got to remember that the Russians, because of their continuous fighting with the Golden Horde and the successor states, the Nogais, the Girai Khans of the Crimea, whatever, they were perpetually exposed to Persian, Mongol, and Turkish ideas about arms and armor. And probably, judging by the Armenian trades from Lvov in Poland at the time, they actually had real craftsmen coming up working for them. Because there's very good examples of people who came from one area and went to another and brought their skills with them. And certainly the Russian state, the Grand Duchy of Moscow and later Tsardom, was very much interested in getting the best quality stuff they could. I mean, there are beautiful Persian sword blades in the Kremlin armory and in St. Petersburg that were collected by boyars, tsars, whatever, because the Russians had good taste in weapons.
Yes.
And I mean, some of the most beautiful helmets and whatever are in Russian collections. So, and I mean, there are old Persian helmets that are in Russian collections that didn't survive in Iran, because in Iran, not just the fashion, but the technology and the ideas kept evolving. So things that were really important in 1530, by 1570 were outdated. But in the rest of the world, they said, "Oh, this is good stuff. We'll use this." So, and to be honest, I'm sure that there were parts of Iran where technology survived much longer. See, we kind of lose track of the fact, like around the southern part of the Caspian Sea, Mazandaran, Gilan, all these places, there were dynasties there that Timur destroyed that were 1,000 years old when he exterminated them.
Yes, that's true.
I mean, this is incredible.
Yes,
we've got the Maharaja of Mewar in Rajput, in the Rajput area of India, whose family goes back to the 1100s. The Sisodia. I mean, this is an ancient family, but in Mazandaran and Gilan, there were families that went back to the, let me get this straight, to the 200s AD that were wiped out in the 13 and 1400s.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, this is incredible longevity. I mean, obviously these places were very remote, but it makes you wonder how much traditional equipment survived there if it was functional, practical. I mean, you know, people, the thing about weapons is that you might keep a style of dagger because it's traditional, but your gun or your bow gets replaced when there are ones that shoot further or shoot more accurately.
Absolutely.
I mean, you know, there are some things people keep, but there are other things that don't survive.
Okay, just to summarize what we talked about and your talk, it was Iran, Western Asia. You know, nowadays, as you know, that many policymakers, also especially from Iran, say don't call us Middle East. Iran is Western Asia, right? So you know, this is something interesting to say. And Western Asia, let's call it Western Asia, as many colleagues in Iran want to be called that way. Iran is a part, so it's a Western Asian tradition of armor making, like with these riveted mail and then also additional plate and these type of things. And then we had already before scale, as you mentioned it, we discussed about it on this. Then we had an Eastern influence, or in the part of the Sassanid period, where we talked about it from northeast. So where this exposure to Central Asian forces exposed them to lamellar armor, right? So then by this lamellar armor, because why I say that, many people think lamellar armor was introduced in this region only by the Mongols, which is
no, it's much older than that. Well, there's the excavation of the Sasanian lamellar armors from what is it, the Casa Abu Nasr, which are late Sasanian, but the lamellar scale pattern is basically identical to the statue at Taki Bustan. The way that lamellar was used as essentially breast and back plates, I don't think that was very current during the Sasanian period in Western Iran, but it might have been in the East. If you go to the wall paintings from Panjikent, which is Sogdia, which is an Iranian outlier. I mean, it had its own unique language, but it was an Iranian language, and it had its own unique culture, but there was strong Iranian influences in terms of Zoroastrianism, and structural things. Plus, it had a residue of Hellenism too, because of the art style showed signs of that, and there was Indian influence. I mean, this is like the kind of multicultural hub. But they had full length lamellar coats in the 8th and 9th centuries. So that kind of thing, which we associate with the Mongols, was already there.
Yes.
And my guess is it started arriving with the Blue Turks, because in Tang, China, full-length lamellar coats, they were well known. My guess is that in Western Iran, because they already had good manufacturing facilities for making mail, they adopted a Jorshan,
yes,
because it was complementary to what they already had and gave them a good structure, particularly around the abdomen and the chest, gave them good protection on top of the mail without having to go the full hog. There was no reason for them to adopt the East Asian style unless they were in direct conflict with them. When the Mongols arrive, they come. See, most of the invasions that came from the east, like the Huns and the Avars, well, the Avars maybe are an exception, but the Huns and other peoples like that, they gradually moved from east to west. But the Mongols did it in a couple of years. So they had Far Eastern equipment, arrived in Iran. When they decided to settle there, they said to, and we're looking at villages of craftsmen and whatever, they said, we want you to make this. Here's an example, away you go. But the Mongols were only a small proportion of the population of Iran, and they were only probably a small proportion of the military population of Iran. Now, if you wanted to rise up in the Mongol ranks, you would wear Mongol armor. You would take part in you'd be part of a Mongol regiment or whatever. But there were literally hundreds of thousands of people living in small villages and whatever that were still buying mail.
Yes.
And were still using their traditional weapons because they weren't that far away. They're not ineffective. The Mongols' advantage wasn't that they had tons of weapons, technology, innovations. It was that they had a better strategic and tactical organization.
Yes.
And I mean, that lasted a long time. Even when the integration of the Mongol Empire collapsed, the Mongols were still very dangerous if they stuck to their basic tactics. But everybody makes mistakes. And my classic is Shah Ismail, who was totally successful using hit and run tactics, guerrilla warfare, scorched earth, everything like that, up until Chaldiran, where he decided to go head to head with the Ottomans. He still could have won that war had he not done that. And it's always so dangerous for people interested in military history to assume that because something happened, it was inevitable. A lot of things weren't inevitable.
Yes.
And I mean, you only have to look at the number of times Alexander the Great almost got killed. If he got killed, there would have still been an Achaemenid empire, and probably his generals would have ruled Anatolia and Syria. And that was, but because he didn't get killed, because he was lucky, because of the roll of the dice, the whole Iranian empire disappeared.
Yes.
But not Iranian culture. And the same thing happened with the Mongols. They didn't take those kind of risks. They were much more, and I don't know why. I don't know why Chinggis Khan and his generals were so much smarter in terms of military tactics and that than other people. I do know that the same as everybody else, couple of generations, they lost that cohesion.
Yes.
And there's the great Maghrebi scholar Ibn Khaldun, who reckoned that the barbarian vigor that makes a new dynasty disappears in 3 or 4 generations. The first generation is tough as nails, and they'll fight for anything because they're poor and they really need everything and they've got nothing to lose. The second generation grew up with these guys and knows how to fight really hard. The third generation grew up in a palace, and the fourth generation is completely lost. In Australia, there's a saying about wealth and power in families. It's sand shoes to sand shoes in 3 generations. So you start off wearing sand shoes, you get rich, your kids go to good universities, they get richer, and then the grandkids waste it all and end up back in poverty again.
That's interesting. Good saying.
Yeah, well, this is the advantage of a culture with a short history. We're more focused on what happened yesterday than we are what happened 200 years ago. And it's so true. The nature of the Chinese bureaucracy in the imperial period was the same. Big, rich families rarely lasted more than 3 generations because the government, they would get into government, they would try and get wealth for themselves, their rivals would catch them, and the family would be wiped out. The same thing with Ottoman Grand Viziers. They would become very successful for the Sultan. They would start to accumulate wealth for themselves. They would get to a certain point and the Sultan would say, well, it's better to kill them and harvest all their wealth back into the state. They did the same. The Ilkhans had the same thing. Rashid ad-Din, he had that problem. His sons had that problem. His grandsons had that problem. They were all brilliant people, but the system was designed to use them up and then seize their assets.
Yes.
And
Just,
go
yes.
on.
Just the last question. Just please help me. I think this is, if I remember it correctly, and I don't remember the name of the book. There is, I think he was Italian who went to the Golden Horde and wrote about them. I don't remember his name. Do you know? You know which
Well,
one?
there's a group of Italian ambassadors that went through the Golden Horde on the way to Iran and Eastern Anatolia.
Yeah.
Barbaro, Contarini, people like this, and they wrote detailed accounts of what they saw. You have Ibn Battuta from Morocco, who visited the Golden Horde. He went from Morocco through the great African kingdoms, through Egypt under the Mamluks, through Iran to China and back, and left lots of interesting observations about what people were doing. Marco Polo, who there's a lot of arguments about, but I think they're wrong-headed. The big argument about Marco Polo is, why didn't he mention the fact that of the Great Wall? And the answer is that when he went through, you wouldn't have noticed it. It was just a series of mounds and hills. The Great Wall that we see was built in the Ming Dynasty. So there's William of Rubric went through when the Golden Horde was really strong, when it was actually the Golden Horde is what we call it and the Russians called it. Its name in Mongol was Batu's Horde. Yes. And it was Batu's descendants that controlled it for a long time. Then there's Gian de Plano Carpini, who went through. These were religious people sent as envoys of the Pope to the Great Khan, the whoever was Khan at the time.
And one of them says that if my memory doesn't, if I remember it correctly, he says that he saw a Mongol who had a mail armor, and he bought it somewhere, and he was extremely proud of that. Something in those lines, right?
Oh, I'd have to look it up. I remember one of them describing Lamellar armor, where he saw it, he described it accurately, but he made assumptions that were a bit confusing. He said that the plates, he said it was the metal plates were shiny. He said that the scales were the width of the hand long, and the width of a finger broad, and they had 8 holes. And he described how it was put together. And if you look at the shoulder armor on surviving Tibetan Lamellar armors, the scales are shorter than that because it's for the shoulders and they're more flexible. But they have 8 holes and they're laced together exactly in the method that he described. And these were made 500 years later. Mail, there's several references to mail. I'm trying. I think I know the one you're talking about, but I'm not. I can't bring it to mind. Because my main interest, I see. The thing is, if you look at burials in the Golden Horde, almost everybody in the 14th century and after, if they've got armor with them, it's male. And the other thing that's really interesting is these burials often have those Persian helmets with the face, the metal face. Yes. So, despite the fact that the Golden Horde was fighting the Ilkhanids all the time, there was quite clearly a lot of trade going backwards and forwards between them. Yes. Yes. And the Italians are interesting because there's a very in the album, the Hazini 2153, there is a painting of Isfandiyar collapsing from the fumes of the dragon that he's fighting. Yes. And he's got articulated gauntlets attached to his bazubands, and he's got armored shoes attached to his greaves. And these are so beautifully drawn. We know that at least, I think it was Venice or Genoa, sold 300 or 600 suits of armor to one of the Ilkhans, European suits of armor, which then would have been put together to fit in. See, it was an international world.
Yes,
And
it was. Exactly.
I'm not, I don't want to criticize people because we both assume a degree of internationalism that probably didn't exist. And on the other hand, we think of a degree of nationalism that didn't exist. I mean, in Iran, you had Iranian-speaking people, and you had a very large number of Turkic-speaking people.
Yeah.
And you had in the extreme southeast, you had Brahui-speaking people who were, you know, like this is a whole different language group. So every country that we look at was more complex than we think. I mean, the classic is Anatolia, right?
Yeah.
It gets conquered by the so you had people speaking Greek, people speaking Armenian, people speaking Turkish. You go back 300 years, you had people speaking Greek, people speaking Armenian, people speaking descendant languages of Luwian, which is a Hittite language, people speaking Galatian, which is a Celtic language from Central Europe, and people speaking Latin, because that was the, Eastern Roman Empire, everybody spoke Koine, they spoke Greek, but the cultured people could speak Latin because you write something to the emperor in the West, you wanted to write it in Latin, you didn't write it in Greek. And we think in terms of homogenous groups because we can draw a line around them, but they weren't homogenous. Of northeastern Anatolia, there were Laz people who spoke a language that's Caucasian from the Caucasus, unrelated to anything else. I think Laz is vaguely related to some of the West Caucasian languages. I don't know. But I remember there's a little Laz restaurant in Sydney. It's actually a takeaway place, and it's basically Turkish food. But they're Laz people, and they haven't forgotten their heritage. And there's some slightly different dishes. And you just think these places, Iran, Anatolia, what's now Syria and Palestine, Israel, and all that, they were immensely complex places. You had different ethnicities, you had different languages, you had different religions, and you had complex interacting technologies. And and of course you've got international trade as well. So this is a massively complex thing. And to say, well, why did the Mongols clearly came in and they wore Mongol armor because they just come from Mongolia. But when they settled down in Iran, they obviously would have seen lots of mail because that was being manufactured in large quantities. Marco Polo, when he went through Iran, listed cities that were making arms and arms. And this was a big time thing. It wasn't like like two villages in Iran made mail and two villages made swords. It was hundreds of villages. It was small towns. It was cities.
Yes. Thank you very much for talking about armor today, Bede. So we are going, as usual, also, to continue our discussions on other topics. I just thank you, and we will discuss on other topics soon later.